right, I'm going to go ahead and call this Assembly Rules Committee meeting of the whole to order. Let's go ahead and start with introductions, starting on this side. John.
Suzanne LaFrance. Crystal Kennedy.
Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera. And we're joined by... Yeah.
May Zalatel.
All right. And then, Dee, do you want to join us at the table? You usually do. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a report from the Assembly Chair. Mr. Chair?
No, right? No, I was on the, now we have an Assembly Chair's report here too. I guess we did before, don't we? Yeah, I don't have anything direct. I'll use my regular comments if something else comes up.
Cool. Then I was asked by the administration to squeeze something in before we get to Assembly priorities. Mr. Wilbur is here to give an update on the MLNP sale, specifically from a budget perspective.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many of you may have heard that we were anticipating that the RCA would make their decision today on the transaction of sale of MLNP. They've elected to exercise their 90-day extension, so they're now on a schedule which will then make a final decision on the 28th of May. And so that's the ability that they have. I'll just remind the Assembly that when we built the 2020 budget and as approved by the Assembly, we built it on this schedule. We built it back in November, and as the Assembly approved it, that they would go till the 28th. It's likely that they would exercise this extension, and then the transaction would occur, and then any revenues coming in as a result of the sale, that would probably take place in the third quarter. So as far as the approved 2020 budget, this action of the RCA doesn't influence the current approved budget schedule. It will influence a little bit about some of the things that we might have been able to entertain in first quarter, but as we are building first quarter, we will then address those things. I just wanted to make sure that the Assembly and any members of the public might be interested. The 90-day extension as exercised by RCA doesn't affect our current budget. It just will come into a different approach to 2020. So if you have any questions on that, on the budget process, please let us know. Obviously, Chief of Staff, the CFO, and Mr. Falsey and I will be figuring out what we're going to do as first quarter. And just as a reminder, the department's submissions for first quarter budget revisions are due to my office today by close of business. And I think I have what I expect from everybody so far. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have a couple questions for you, Forrest.
Yeah, I apologize. I got a little distracted here. So I apologize. You might have actually just answered this, but just to double check.
I did.
In what way will the extension change the payments out of the trust that are built into our budget?
The only thing that would change is if we adjusted the amount that we wanted to put into the trust. That would be it. The schedule is not going to influence it. The only thing that would influence it is as a result of the amount that we had originally anticipated. If that number changes, then it will change the final number. But right now, I think we have 225 in there.
But we expected deposit it in June.
From a budget perspective, as long as the receipts are in and the cash is in, and we get the money by December 31st, if we get it in May, get it in June, or get it in September, it doesn't matter from a budget perspective.
But we built into our budget an assumption about interest payments.
We did.
So we just, how would we, if we don't get the money, how are we going to receive those interest payments for this year?
So I talked to the CFO, and we talked about the schedule on how we would receive them, and depending on the amount based on a quarters of return or a year of return. So I was talking to Alex about that. We can share that with you as well.
I just don't understand how this isn't going to push back the date of close, unless the date of deposit, unless the date of increased interest payments off of it. It just doesn't seem, I don't understand. I just don't understand.
The way we built the budget was based on this exact schedule.
Okay.
This is the path. The balanced budget we built is based on that, Mr. Dunbar. It's just if the number that we actually eventually put into the trust is a little less or a little more, it will affect the balanced budget.
Okay, that's fine. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks. John?
This might get beyond what you're able to talk to, but it sounds like reading RCA, they're going, $750 million is a better price. That's a huge difference from $1 billion. Where do we draw the line on up or out?
That's a good question that I can't.
Who draws that line? Was it in the ballot measure? We just said about $1 billion.
We did.
So who gets to decide, oh, 750 million is about $1 billion?
I don't know. I mean, I have an idea, but it's probably a legal question more than a budget question.
Thanks. All right, any other questions for Lance? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so then moving on to assembly priorities. First, hopefully everyone has a copy. If not, I do have extra copies of it for folks who don't have a copy of the priorities document. So briefly, so I have, as I said I would at the last Rules Committee meeting, emailed this out to all of the partners that are listed in the document, and have received actually quite a lot of positive feedback from the partners listed in the document, including several members of the legislature. And then put an invitation for anyone who wanted to meet and talk about this. And so the three organizations that have accepted that invitation are Visit Anchorage, Awake, and Star. This list that was just passed out are folks that I didn't have an explicit contact for in any of these categories. So if you have any contacts for these, I'd be happy to send the document out again to those additional contacts. Getting into the meat of it, so this is going to be our first dive into the goals. There's going to be 3 pillars have expressed interest in going today, and then the other 2 we're going to go next month. So if we like the way that this is going, then we're just going to repeat this, or maybe we'll change it up. But this is going to be our first time getting into it. So the 3 we're going in today are communications, homelessness, and public safety. Public safety, we might wait until Pete gets back because he had to leave for something, and then we'll be back shortly. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with communications. So it's page 3 for folks who, does anyone need it? Or does everyone? Yeah. Sure, I'm gonna want this back, though, Mr. Haberman. And for everyone else, I'm gonna want these back. Sure. Okay, so Meg, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
So the communications pillar is being worked on right now by myself, Chris Constant, and Austin Quinn Davidson, and we are helped by Jennifer in the clerk's office. We came up with our first action item, which was an out of office or an automatic reply to the email. You have a proposed reply in front of you. So when people email us at WMAS, it would send this back, basically saying we've reached all 11 of us. If you want to reach your member directly, you can find their contact information below. And if you're not sure who your member is, you can look that up. The idea being here in particular, if we are in a particularly hot time of email, let's use, Mr. Peterson's not here, so we use the traffic ordinance, but we got a lot of emails. So if you have another individual trying to reach you but has reached you via, or has an issue that's really more district specific, they can kind of start to find their contact a little bit easier. And I've actually had a few phone calls because I have my personal cell phone listed on the thing where people are trying to figure out who their members are. And I honestly, when someone just gives me an address, I have to go use this tool, so it would be nice if they got kind of something back where they could figure out the tool. This would only send back 1 reply message, not 11. We double checked on that point because it is coming to 11 of us. So we'd like your feedback. If you like it, don't like it, we'd be interested in instituting it. We think it would be great. So that's our first big accomplishment under the communications pillar.
Yeah, John?
You have that link so they can click on it and figure out where they are. But you can also, like, I've learned to do South Anchorage turning on Gurdon because it's not intuitive, right? A lot of people, some people are saying south is south and Tudor, because some you can get way detailed.
Sure.
But in this, that's just my standard now. And I imagine, I don't know if other districts.
If you mark it up, we can take that back and we can make that edit. That's easy enough to do. If you kind of have shorthand that you always refer to your district as, I think that's a great thing, and it would be consistent.
Yeah, Suzanne?
Thank you, Felix. I love this. This is great. And actually, I was at an event last night talking to folks, and the main topic of conversation was, which district are you in? And I know there was someone in Chudiak who thought they might be part of that suit. And I showed them the map, and there were questions about if you live on base, what district are you in, and it's always, I always find it a little bit confusing when we start talking about diamonds, because of how it kind of runs into the town or an area. So this is great. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. Forrest?
Thank you. The one edit, let's see here. The one edit I might suggest is when it says if you'd like to contact representatives, I might change that word. There's a lot of confusion about state house reps versus assembly members, and so saying something like if you'd like to contact your district members, maybe because you're trying to say specifically the people from your district, but I always try to avoid the word representative when I'm talking about us.
Any objection to it just being assembly members? And maybe with the S in parentheses?
I did, thank you. Read my
Okay.
mind. Hopefully for just a short bit.
So, okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
That way it's just really clear.
Would that be changed? Would that be changed in the first paragraph then too, where it says your representative?
Yeah, we'll just be consistent where it says representative, we'll just change it to assembly member.
Oh, that was where I was looking at soon
Yeah.
first. I didn't even notice
So,
it down there.
oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you, instead of representatives, just say us. Right on that, we appreciate you taking the time.
To email us.
Make that simple.
It is
Individually? Contact us individually or?
Okay.
Cool.
All right. I will get all the edits, and before it were to go live, but how much heads up do you guys want? Like 2 days, 24 hours? Okay.
Pull the
None?
trigger, yeah.
Just-
Just
okay.
whatever.
All right. Then the other thing in the communications pillar, we have been fortunate. Felix has created a newsletter format, and he has said it's okay if we all just borrow it if you want to put out your own newsletter. So we will circulate that. It's kind of like a fill-in form, and I will ask Felix to talk briefly about how we send that newsletter out, because we've had kind of mixed results using FCC versus emailing every community council president directly.
Yeah, sure. So, which, yeah, reminds me I have to work on next month's newsletter. But, so the way that works is as close to the first of the month, or at least before the first meeting of the community council of that month, which for us in Midtown is the first Wednesday of the month. I have been sending out an email to all of the officers of each of the community councils, and including the FCC as well. And then I ask everyone to email this out to their respective e-lists. The FCC is sort of iffy on whether they'll actually email it out to everyone in the e-lists. They've done it like 2 or 3 times, and then they haven't done it 2 or 3 times. The one that's actually really consistent is Midtown Community Council. They'll always make sure that it gets emailed out to their e-lists. And so yeah, that's pretty much how I try to get it out there, because it's this, I always frame it as it's our e-newsletter. I never print copies of it or have it copies of it for any of the assembly meetings or the community council meetings.
And I think when I came to your meeting, Meg, one of my concerns was that probably for the time being, your bulletin should be status type things, not advocacy.
Yeah.
And that's what the Midtown one currently is, and I can send out fast copies of those if folks want to see them.
Right.
And I think if we know who's going to be doing it or consistently, we can work with Mark Butler at FCC a little more closely, so we can get these tied to the agenda emails going out. We don't need to recreate the wheel here. We need to use the processes that exist. I have one more item once we're done with newsletters.
Yeah, John.
Well, this is maybe quasi-newsletter, but I think there must be some way in Outlook, or an Outlook expert here, where you could do a group. So you call it My Community Council People and add all their stuff, and then you just type in that address, and it does everybody. Does it do that?
Probably
I know the
there is a
old
way to
ones
do
I've
that.
used before. I wouldn't mind some guidance on that, because I know Suzanne had Josh sending just our upcoming agenda to the community council people. I thought it was very helpful to do that. But to type in all their email addresses at the time drive me crazy. But once you do it with a group,
Yeah, I don't do that either. I don't type in email addresses.
I actually just use previous emails.
on reply all.
So
Yeah.
that actually raises a question on the communications plan.
That's a good
I wonder if it would be feasible to work with IT to create an alias or a system of aliases, all FCC, and then District 1 councils, District 2 councils, so that you just type in one thing and it blasts out to all of the leaders of your district.
That's what I'm looking for, some way to get there. And I know
IT
I've
could
done
do it.
that. I have one that's on my personal stuff, it's just called family, and it goes
Right.
on my siblings and so on. So
I could say that we do have some capacity because, for instance, Parks and Rec has to mail out everybody who's within, who's on they have a list or something for certain Parks and Rec's actions. So that has to be all automated.
And I think that we have all of our aliases already in IMAS and all the other ones that, there's all kinds of them. And so our teams could do that. That's the next step for this. It's good. Thank you.
And then the other thing, I just kind of want to plant the seed because I think this is going to raise a lot of questions, and we're going to bring it up at our next communications pillar meeting, is we are talking about member websites that would be kind of a more professional iteration of what we're probably already doing with Facebook. But so we could talk about policy, we could put links to important AOs, ARs, updates, possibly the newsletters. What format that will ultimately take, we're not 100% sure yet. I am in favor of one that provides us the most editorial and stylistic options. And the idea is that on our member page, there would be a link. The big questions are, what does the domain look like? How is it hosted? And some of those things. So if you have ideas about that or concerns about that, start emailing them in so we can have them as fodder for our communications group as we discuss different things around that. Yeah, so I think that's going to be a bit of a multi-tiered conversation, but I did want to toss it out there. I'm particularly interested in that because I think trying to talk about your policy positions on Facebook is nearly impossible. And there's no regulation of the Facebook things now anyway, so.
All right. Great. Yeah, Suzanne.
Thanks, Felix. So I'm not sure, Meg, if this is something that would coincide with the website, but on the issue of getting documents out to folks, like we frequently get requests for, on that amended AO or resolution you passed. I'm not even sure now what's the best way. I know I just emailed for one from Tuesday, but the best way to get those amended versions and how to share them with the public.
Yeah, through the chair, I think right now we just send them out on a case when you ask for them. We send them out. The amendment process after your meetings can take a day or two, sometimes more depending on how crazy we get with the amendments. And then we have, usually the chair signs them the following Tuesday, so that piece too, it can take, a week turnaround for that. So we're just doing it on a case-by-case basis right now with the new meeting manager system that will roll out in the summer. We're looking for a solution where signed ordinances and resolutions are available to the public, just like your agenda packets are. But we don't have that solution yet.
Can I follow?
Yeah, Joe.
And that's good. It's good so we get those up. I think it's a benefit because at some point we left our agendas with all the supporting documents up there, and then that was undone. And now it seems like the last couple times I've looked at the supporting documents remain. I think there was a good argument for not leaving it there because people assume that that's the document, but we've amended it. So there's a risk there. So where are you now? Are you leaving the supporting document?
Well, what,
Looks like you are.
through the chair, what stays up is what is before the assembly at your meeting. So what you see at your meeting, that's what's up on the website. The amended versions wouldn't be there, and you can always tell if it's done or not by is their signature. You know, is their signature on there? But I think you're right. It can be confusing if you're just looking for a certain AR, and you don't know that it's been amended. There's the risk that you think that's the final
We
version.
quit posting. We were taking down that supporting documentation for a while. So we just had the agenda without this, like last year or so, and now it's gone back to the old way.
Okay. I'm not aware of how it was before, but they are there now. They're linked to the document.
Yeah.
Risky.
Risky, but I think it can also be helpful because otherwise it's the only way to look at these documents, right, that the public has. So we need to figure out another solution, and hopefully we will this summer. Okay.
I forgot, just one quick
Oh,
thing.
sure.
I would really recommend as you look at the newsletter template to keep the promotion of the clerk's Facebook page on there. We find that that's really helpful so people can kind of keep abreast of what's happening. So we put, if you want to know more, keep up with us a little bit more in a timely manner other than monthly on the newsletter template. There's a link to the clerk's Facebook page. So that's a little bit of our social media outreach. We're leading that social media more towards the clerk's office right now.
All right. Great. Well, thank you. I like that several of these short-term goals are in process on communications. I guess quick update and actually question for the clerk on the what's ahead. So the what's ahead, want to confirm that the FCC is being included in that?
I believe that is correct.
Okay, great. And then I also think one of the requests that I made was that the media is also included, some segment of the media is also included in our what's ahead, which I think is also a positive thing. Okay, any other questions on short-term or long-term goals for communications? All right, great progress. We'll move on to homelessness. So short-term and long-term goals are on page 4. So, do you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Yep.
So in short-term goals, I've been appointed on the the Coalition to End Homelessness Advisory Board. And that is actually, it's my appointment, but Cameron and I are trying to share the chair, like kind of literally, like to see, so that we're both very much in the loop. There is, on the second bullet point, a monthly meeting to coordinate efforts on communication happening as a regular standing meeting. And we are next, we'll preview, it kind of goes to that third bullet point. We are actually inviting folks with lived experience to our next committee meeting to somewhat ask this question of what ways would you like to see the community involved in the response to homelessness beyond policy making, beyond the fiscal, but what ways we get this question and what better group to ask than those who have experienced or lived experience with homelessness. And then on the long-term goals, I think we, the third bullet down, we started that Identify Solutions to Mental Health and Substance Misuse Issues. We started that a little bit with our legislative program in our ask. Those are definitely longer term and a little bit out of our hands, but I think it'll be a foundational step to know what the state's response is. And then the fourth bullet point, analyze and fund the creation of day center. They're calling them day engagement centers now. That is the nomenclature. And I think you'll see some work around that at first quarter budget revisions.
All right. So, yeah, Forrest.
I'll just also point that the largest step we took in terms of resolving these issues is getting the alcohol tax on the ballot. And if that passes, then some of those goals will, like behavioral health, will have a major new source of funding for it. So hopefully that passes.
All right, thank you. So then I think part of what we wanted to do. Oh, yeah, sure, John.
I should have noticed before, but we have in front of us to do that. Pay for success is like $5 million. That's a huge amount of money, but that's not where you're short long-term goals. We don't really specifically address that program here. That's the by far the hugest amount of money we contemplated.
It
putting
is.
into this.
It would be the second bullet under long-term, engage in a holistic approach between all anchored home partners and data strategies. That's part of the permanent supportive housing piece to the anchored home strategies. And that's multiple partners actually involved in that work beyond just the municipality. And it is supposedly, I mean, I don't know the data offhand, data-driven in how the population is targeted and the outcomes are determined. So it's supposed to be linked to that.
Thanks. Okay, so unlike communications where we have a committee that's working on all the short-term, long-term goals, we also have the Assembly Committee on Homelessness. And so just wanted to, I think part of what Meg wanted to do was just walk through this, see if there's any pieces in here that aren't being worked on. Also, I'm interested in walking through the accountability stuff as well. And then, yeah, we still have time. So in here, the fourth bullet on short-term goals, do you want to talk about how we're moving on that? It's probably not us directly, right? That's the secure funding.
On this one, I'm
Short-term,
sorry.
yeah.
Which one?
Homelessness, short-term, fourth bullet.
1, 2, 3. Oh, secure funding. We did do a little bit of that with regard to the budget in 2020. And I think that's going to be up for reevaluation as to the effectiveness of that and how it plays, the coalition's role and how it plays as we go into the 2021 budget cycle, in particular to its interactions on that warm handoff. But I think some of that will depend on how the summer goes a little bit as well, which actually is one of the accountability bullets, reduction in the number of encampments in our public spaces. I think this is going to be a summer for data. It's going to be a really good summer for data because we have funded the requisite beds to have shelter capacity as long as the appropriation is spent, so that camping isn't the answer. And we are working, Cameron and I, with our private partners about messaging that to individuals utilizing shelter services, that camping is not safe, it is not the right thing to do, and then also the day engagement piece I think will play into that. If we can kind of keep folks engaged in the place where they're staying, we can hopefully reduce some of the public perception of homelessness because it won't be everywhere. So,
Thank you. Suzanne?
Thanks, Felix. I'm not sure where this piece fits, but when we talk about metrics and accountability, it seems that we often get the question as to how much the muni is spending directly and indirectly towards addressing homelessness. There's wondering, Meg, if you could address that piece and if
Sure.
it fits and how.
So directly we are spending on the Parks and Rec now staff MIT, which was about $800,000 in the budget, plus the $735,000 we put in for shelter beds. So do that math because I won't do it on the fly because I'll get it wrong. About $830,000, which was MIT and Parks and Rec, and then $735,000 on shelter beds. And that takes us May to December. We also had whatever the January to April funding amount was for the what we used to call cold weather shelter added in there, but it came out of the 2019 budget. As to indirect costs, that is the tough one to get at. Chris and I asked Audit to try to come up with what that looks like, to some way to measure it, and there just really isn't a good way. A lot of it won't be cost savings, it will be cost avoidance, meaning fire and police will go do what fire and police do, but it won't be directed towards homelessness response, it will be towards their other jobs. And so some of that is the core team reporting about $500,000 in cost avoidance to their department, but we're not going to see that on a ledger sheet very well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
There's one wrinkle to that the people who will see actual cost savings are the hospitals. And because as we establish baseline places, ways to keep people from kind of falling off the edge and ending up in the emergency room, that's where the savings will first accrue. And that doesn't do us much benefit, if you will, from a cost perspective, but as a community, it does great benefits. Hopefully reduces pressure in the emergency rooms, and that's why you see organizations like Providence willing to invest millions and millions of dollars, because they anticipate on the back end of the system a real reduction in cost for them.
Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the funding for the core team is not wrapped up in any of these, but that is a number that we also could specify and put that in.
Some of it, if I might. The core team does address high-end users who are the homeless, kind of, I don't know if it's a pejorative term now, frequent flyers, but actually their mission is all high users
That's
of
true.
the
It's not
911
just
call
homeless, you're
system.
right.
And most of their work isn't there. Whenever they get someone that calls 10 times in a month, targeting that person specifically and driving down the calls. So yes and no. It's like
Okay.
squishy.
Good clarification.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Okay, so then going back to long-term goals, did anyone want to talk or add anything about that first bullet in long-term goals, which is around housing data and filling housing gaps?
We will have the gap analysis coming out in April, which is led by the coalition. That will be a big piece to that, so that we can look at it in terms of policy. There's also a companion piece happening, and the municipality as well.
That's social service gaps, or is that housing gaps?
That is housing gaps.
Okay.
Continuum gaps, I guess I would say,
Okay.
as the continuum of care. And then there's a companion piece happening at the municipal level as well. And that data should all be available in April, early May.
Got it.
And then we'll have that so that we can look at any policy strategies that we might need to utilize.
Great, thank you. Then moving on to the accountability piece. So we have 5 pieces in here on accountability. Does anyone want to go through any of these, talk about any of them?
I think a couple of these will have to kind of wait until we get our summer point and time count, particularly the first one, and our next winter point and time count to see if our strategies have done anything. Similarly with number 2. Number 3, as I said, that the number of encampments, that will really be the paradigm shift hopefully this summer. I think that will also go with number 4. And the number of public forums to discuss homelessness. So this has been interesting. With regard to Anchor Home, they found that the big public meetings weren't necessarily accomplishing what they were hoping to accomplish, that people came in with such divergent interests to those meetings. So right now, the forum is the committee. And we've accommodated that by having 2 public participation opportunities, one at the beginning, so if you really just want to come in and say something, you have the players in the room. And then the second, if you want to kind of respond to something. And we think that's going well so far, and that's something Cameron and I are willing to continue with that committee. It may mean occasionally having some special committee meetings in the evening. And we're going to kind of evaluate, are we hearing from people who can't access that committee? But we may also work with the clerk's office on using some social media strategies for that as well.
Okay. Yeah, I guess on that point, I think one of the reasons that one was under accountability was, I think, the need for us to better communicate and be accountable to communicating to our constituents. So yeah, I'm excited to hear about some of the strategies the committee is going to have for that. Okay, any other discussion on accountability measures? Yeah, John.
Well, two things. I think Maggie said, we need to wait until we get the first of our summer counts. I understood we only have
No,
one.
until we get our summer count, and then our winter count again, so we have those comparison points.
What does the census provide us? I mean, are they going out to tent cities?
Yeah, so I forget what the specific term is, but they do have subgroups that are going out and counting, and so one of them is for homelessness. So yeah,
a breakout that says here's how many people we counted in the woods.
I don't think we're going to get something specific to homelessness. No, they collate all the data because
Do
it's
they say
private.
like housing type, REI 10?
I don't think we wouldn't get that data because it's all collated and so that the only thing that we're going to see on that data. I think we're going to just see raw numbers. I don't think we're going to see homeless, housed.
If I might, I think they do capture addresses, and but they don't report specific addresses, but they will have data on people who are addressed to places that are not specific. And so, because they still capture those people, just like we allow people to register to vote. So it might be a good question to run up the flagpole, how they're going to capture that data, and how it might be reported back in an aggregated way for us to use.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, everyone, you fill in your address.
I have to feel like and maybe Daryl, you can help me because you've been part of these discussions, but I have to feel like for the ones that are in camps, they're going to use an approximate address that's close to the camp as their address.
I'm not sure, but they use coordinates. For example, but I don't know if they use an actual address.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good question. We'll figure that out. And just want to note for the record, we've been joined by Cameron Perez-Verdia. Okay, so then if there's nothing else on there, I'm going to wait to do public safety until Pete gets back, which should be any minute now. So we're going to go ahead and move on then to assembly member discussion on pending business. So just like normal, going round table and talking about what we're doing. So I'll start with you, John.
Here's two things. One, I think a lot of home builders had some issues, and I think Forrest submitted it, so that'll be different. And I think there should be a lot of discussion. That's a starting point for some of their issues. And then there's a resolution comment that's in support of House bill that Chuck Cobb has that helps clarify the railroad's claims to exclusive use, which is something that piggybacks on something.
Check out the eternal war against the railroad.
Well, if I might on that topic, I've seen now some communications where the railroad has asked the congressional delegation to intervene and conduct an analysis through the Government Accountability Office on some very specific questions.
Right. So I talked to Mike Kulowski at Murkowski yesterday, and he said that study is in says because it comes from a member, it's a tier 1 priority. He says that means never going to happen. I don't know why or anything, but he said his impression was it was really a stalling tactic, which is stated in what we got from the neighbors too. They felt it was that way. So that's it.
And since we're on the record, if you know, the railroad blames John for all of this. So.
Someone's got to take it.
There we go.
He's the hero. So.
You're their favorite guy. All right. Thanks, John. Anything else?
No.
All right. Suzanne?
Thanks, Felix. So on the topic of the resolution, because our Ocean Bugle Sewer Community Council is super active in it, John and Fred and I are co-sponsoring that. And actually, one question I had, if I can ask John, is I know we want to set it for a public hearing. And last time there was a resolution, we held a work session after the fact. And so should we maybe, I mean, I'm thinking maybe we want to have a work session before, or maybe it could be
be accomplished by just having a meeting with some of the folks at the railroad, I don't know.
I mean, my sense on that is we'll introduce it, everybody read it with the documents and decide if we want a work session. Because we will set it for public hearing.
And then Dean.
I think the resolution the clerk suggested we asked for it in the 9F for introduction on March 10th and set public hearing for March 24th. So that's
Can we wait?
You could have a work session in between.
So, sorry.
Do you
Yes,
want
sir.
to wait, see, everybody read it, decide if you want a work session or a set one?
Yeah, I guess we'll see it next week, right? Chris?
Has a draft been sent to the railroad?
I just
I haven't
came
sent
out,
one.
no, not yet, but we will.
Please.
I will personally send it to Tom.
They will get it probably interpreted.
Yeah, that would be great.
Like owls and letters, make sure it's Tim.
Board doesn't tree 11 multipliers.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Okay. We've got a tobacco 21 working group meeting that Daryl's heading up for next week, where we'll be talking about progressive discipline, ASD, and considering whether or not we want to add a penalty for minor possession back to our local code. I don't know how long. I mean, I assume as soon as the legislators see our resolution, they're going to drop everything and fix that problem.
Oh, yeah?
So, so maybe we won't need to
Should be
take
writing
more
all my
action.
resolutions.
Suzanne, on
Yeah.
that one, when you're working on progressive discipline with ASD, make sure that whatever it is, it goes into the board adopted policy. Otherwise, school handbooks can vary by school or by secondary or elementary or the like. So just make sure, so it'd have to be a board adopted. But that makes it consistent across all schools.
So a board adopted policy for
yeah.
consistency across all schools?
Yes.
Okay. You know
Of course.
what's that?
That's of course assuming that the school board enforces that, right? But yeah, John?
Just a comment on that, right? It's interesting, so I look towards service here, you February, towards schools, February service. Last year, I talked to the principal there, so these kids are vaping in the bathrooms all the time, we're always down, and we can see from the stats, it's quite high. South and service. I was at Bartlett, and East, and East, principal said, no, we don't really see it here. It shocks me, it's the same pool of kids, it's so different percent, maybe he's right, they're not maybe there, or they just don't notice or look, I don't know, it's interesting.
Economics.
Yeah, I asked about that too, because maybe it's expensive, so, you know, a rich person's, anyway, so schools are very different.
Thanks. Anything else, Suzanne?
That's it for now. Thanks.
Thanks. Crystal?
I don't think I have anything, thank you.
All right. Thanks. Meg?
Most of my work in the next month is really going to be around data engagement centers and trying to figure out what first quarter money there is or isn't available, and working with our partners so that we can really have something this summer, because I think that's going to be imperative, as well as making sure our appropriation gets spent in a timely manner so that we don't have a shelter gap. That's it.
Thank you. Pete?
Is this pending business? Is that what we are?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually spoke with Maud Tosi yesterday about putting a resolution together commemorating the life of Coach Chuck White. And so that's sort of been started, sent Dean an email, so it was on his radar. So we're collecting information, seeing if the family is going to be available to come and accept this resolution on our meeting of the 24th. That's currently the plan. If they're not available, we'll do it when they are. So that's where we are on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Forrest?
Good job, Pete. Yeah, three things. One, John already mentioned the home builders ordinance. I've asked Dean to start working on that. And I should call it the home builders ordinance, I say. An ordinance intended to promote affordable housing in Anchorage, we'll call it that. So we're working on that. The domestic violence ordinance that myself and Ms. Zalatel and Mr. Wellington have been working on. I just got back from the administration today or yesterday. Oh, Mr. Slivka's in the room. That there's some issue with CAMA. I don't know if that is going to slow down the introduction of the ordinance. I mean, I asked them, could we do this? And their answer now is, it is technically impossible to not have a searchable database available online, which, Mr. Slivka, you can correct me at some later date, but that to me is not a satisfying answer. So that might come forward. And the last thing I'm working on is an ordinance that I mentioned before to expand the definition of veteran for our veterans hiring preference. Now we have a very strange, narrow definition that requires you to have served in like certain wars. And it's out of step with the Veterans Administration and other people. And so I sent a draft of that to the Veterans Commission. I haven't gotten much feedback back. The Veterans Commission is meeting next week, and I'm going to try to attend that again. And then once I've sort of sufficiently heard back from them, I plan to introduce that probably on the 10th or the 24th. There's also a resolution that I'm just starting to work on now, having to do with veterans and getting outdoors, basically. The outdoor recreation as a form of veterans' health that an activist has sort of brought to my attention, and there's a bill in Congress that's about that. And so I'm hoping to talk to the Veterans Commission about that as well, and then perhaps have a resolution on that in the near future. So that would be another one of our, please, you other legislative body, pass this bill kind of thing, if the Veterans Commission agrees with it. I see Mr. Slivko.
So I'll clarify the comment. What can't happen now is we can't have the database with the names in there and then just choose to not search some names. What we can do is, I'm sure that the name field has to be filled out, and I think we could replicate what they do in Seattle, which they says if you're the applicable person, your address is the Secretary of State and a number, and then we have a database that has that number, and that's how information related to the property actually gets transmitted to the person. But if you search the database online, all you see is that property, the name on the property is some nominal name, like the MOA or something like that.
So I think I believe, and Mr. Gates can correct me, but I believe the ordinance is written just says we will no longer be able to search by name. I'm not going to do a thing where you have to apply to get your name taken down. You would just no longer be able to search by anyone's name, any human being's name, the property database. You can still search by parcel. I mean, if you know the parcel, you can get all the information you need from it. But I think it's a privacy thing that, frankly, everybody should be impacted by, but particularly the people that are, that have a variety of sensitive reasons not to be on there. Are you saying that can't be done? That you can't just disable that search feature?
I would say that we're not in a position right now where we could do the programming to disable that search feature, because we're in the process of upgrading the entire software system. And so making any changes now while we're in the midst of this upgrade process is not feasible.
Right, but then so just, may I continue, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
The date you gave me is targeted third quarter 2021. That is just too far out. I mean, we've been getting emails from domestic violence survivors for years. We've been working on this specific thing for 6 months, and now you're saying, well, no, it's going to be 16, 18 months out at the least. I mean, that's just too slow. I mean, I'm just not willing to not introduce anything for 18 months because we've started another IT upgrade project. So, yeah.
This IT project is one of the largest we have going.
Right. So maybe 5 years from now, I guess
No,
was.
but it really is large, and one of the deals to be able to get implemented in a timely fashion is that we can't make changes at the current time. And we do have inquiries in now that we know that we're making this capability to the current project manager to say, can you tell us whether this can be done with the new system?
Okay.
Our current system is one step from falling. We have no backup for it. It's an old system. This has been needed to be done for years, and it kept being put on hold.
So I guess what I'm putting forward is that suggested alternative that many states do is that they specifically shield
the information for the protected class and allow the searchability process to continue further.
Can we make the protected class every resident in Anchorage? Does it have to be manually entered, or if the code can make it protected class for 1,000 people, can it do it for 300,000 people?
I think that would, I'll explore that. I want to say the answer is probably.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
Meg.
stepped out, I apologize. So we can remove individuals, but we can't make it non-searchable generally? Did I get that right?
Yes.
I mean, I will say I would like to be able to get people off who want to be off
Yeah.
as soon as possible,
Sure.
knowing that we also have some statewide advocacy to do. I think that's, but it's not, it's an imperfect solution.
There was a wrinkle or nuance that it wasn't that they would be off, it's that their information would be redirected to a third-party site, like a third-party address MOA instead of their specific address. But I think I heard you say is we can't just take people's names out because of functionality, but we can put an address that says,
It's a dummy address, though.
yeah, it's small.
City Hall.
Yes.
Okay.
It's the Anchorage Police Department. Here, go there to try to harass somebody.
That's a great idea.
Good analysis.
All right. Thank you. Chris?
I just have a tobacco licensing project I started looking at. Other than that, everything I've got going on, we've already talked about.
Okay. So for my list of things, so a couple things already on the agenda. We have the substance misuse ordinance that I've been working with Suzanne LaFrance and Austin Davidson on. And then, of course, the MCR resolution I'm working with Chris on that we just had a work session on. Then other things soon to be. So in May, it's going to be National Kids to Parks Day. And so I've worked with the Parks Foundation and Parks and Rec on a resolution for that. They should be also working on bringing a bunch of folks to accept the resolution, and they might be doing a special event for it too. Chris mentioned this at the last meeting of the Rules Committee meeting about a conversion therapy ban that him and I are working on that's going to be specifically for minors, and so that's going to be coming in April. Then I'm still doing research on halfway houses and met with both the Partners for Progress and the Alaska Correctional Officers Association. And, of note, I think why it's a little bit timely is the DOC is potentially, as part of their operation to reopen Palmer Correctional Facility, is looking at reopening Parkview, Glenwood, or both of them in the pretty short time frame. And so if they're going to be reopening those, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure there's no public safety ramifications there.
I'm sorry, Felix, could you explain what those are? Parkview and Glenwood?
Yeah, Parkview and Glenwood are two halfway houses that were closed because they were so operated inefficiently, and it was almost every day that we would get a Nixle alert that someone ran away from those facilities. And so DOC is potentially opening one or both of those again as part of its operation to reopen Palmer. Then on climate change, so this has been a little bit slow going, but building up the youth advocacy through the Youth Advisory Commission. They actually met last night, and I haven't gotten an update on how their meeting went, but I'm hoping that they are going to be moving forward with adopting some type of youth advisory council as part of their commission. I've also been assisting with getting new members on that commission. I didn't realize it, but that commission is very poorly staffed in terms of the amount of people on the commission. So trying to up the numbers on the commission. Then on the 2020 census, working on getting some Spanish PSAs on the radio and just doing some specific outreach in that particular community. And other commissioners are working within other communities as well. Just a reminder, folks will start hearing a lot more about the census come mid-March when you'll receive something in the mailbox. That is it from me on pending business. Cameron?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts, but questions. Chris, where are we on the Eklutna, or maybe Forrest, where are we on sort of meetings to begin to plan the conversations around relationship between municipality and Anchorage and Eklutna? Chris is on that.
Yeah, he's eating pizza right now, but
Okay.
circle back to that.
So we'll sort of circle back to that. Was there a bond flyer created, and have we received that for the municipal bonds that we bring to community councils? And is there a flyer that was created by the administration?
So last night, at the Loop Community Council, all the propositions were printed off, and I believe that came out of the FCC.
No, what I mean is that did the municipality create a flyer of some kind to talk about municipal bonds, like the school district does? They have this beautiful flyer where it explains the bonds, and I was under the impression that was being created by some.
We always produce a review, just like women always just put that small and get the web page now.
So, because Austin sent a message, I think, to someone, and I'm just trying to track it down. I have a whole bunch of meetings coming up.
Yeah, so I don't think the municipality ever does that, like the school district does.
Okay,
What the municipality does is we work with a group called Anchorage Tomorrow.
Okay.
And they're the official advocacy group for the bonds, and so they're the ones that are charged with creating those flyers and talking to the community councils about all the bonds. Whether they've been doing that this season or not, I don't think they have.
Okay. So there's nothing. So right now, what I guess I'm looking for some advice. I need to go to these meetings and bring all sort of information to give out on the FCCC website, and that's where to get the information at this point.
So this was a paper packet,
Okay.
I believe, that they had at the FCC meeting that they handed out, and so that particular community council president made copies of it for the members.
Okay, so
And it was
we don't see that as part of our role to actually
What is that
report
packet?
out to
Is that
It
just
was
the
every
actual bonds?
every proposition as listed, 1 through 14, 13.
What's an email?
We don't do that?
No, we as the assembly have not historically created a document like that. That's
Okay.
the question. I can't speak to whether the administration has or not. I think that Felix is right. That usually it's Anchorage Tomorrow, but I haven't seen anything from them this year.
All right, I'll go back and look at the email because I thought some of it was being generated within the administration. So I'll go back and see.
I thought
Jason?
we did receive an email that didn't have any analysis. It just had literally the language that's going to be on the ballot for all of the propositions. I got an email to that effect.
Oh, I mean, that's what was at the community council. I thought they got it he got it from FCC.
Yeah, I don't know where I got it from, but I know I received it and reviewed it.
Okay. Anyway, I'll work on trying to let that down. Eklutna, Anchorage Municipality communication meetings. I just was trying to get an update on that, and so the group was aware of it as well.
Yeah, so hopefully, time is ticking so quickly that we were going to have a day of meetings with us, the sponsors, and Eklutna. It just hasn't been scheduled yet. We had a day on the calendar, but all that work is going to happen before we bring anything forward again. There was just so much heat that we want to make sure we have alignment first before we come forward with any kind of process.
Are you still looking to a consultant?
Yes.
Okay.
The consultant that everyone kind of agreed upon, it just isn't in the state right now. So.
Okay. And then just I'm behind on this, but I brought forward Megan. I brought forward the Step Big Up initiative, and then we postponed it, and then postponed it. Working on planning future meetings on that, and there's and how that aligns with, for instance, the work around developing crisis now that the Mental Health Trust is working on, that model, and sort of how these sort of efforts are converging, I think is the question now. And so working on trying to set up a meeting with the health department and others so that we can bring it sort of to the next meeting. And is it appropriate for in this? So if there are notes from meetings from these things, and I mentioned to you that I would send it to you, is that something that I can just distribute for all, or
Through the clerk?
Okay, right. So I'll send it to the clerk and have that was it. Thanks.
All right, great. So what I'm going to do, because I want to make sure we're done by 1 o'clock, is I'm going to move us forward to other items and discuss these first 3. I know these first 3 are timely for us to walk through, and then if we have time after that, I'm going to go back to public safety under assembly priorities. So let's go ahead and start with discussion on naming panels. So I'm just going to read something really quick from Austin that she sent me because she couldn't be here.
Oh, good. Felix, I'm sorry. Can I just say, so OMB created a bond flyer and sent it to the clerk's office, and this was
February 11th.
February 11th.
That's about the board of deed.
Okay, so it's been sent out to us.
Yes.
Okay.
But I'll send it again.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah,
I
Chris.
just want to quickly ask if we can change the agenda. Jason is here and is prepared to provide some brief detail on MLP.
Al spoke to that earlier.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Lance spoke to it.
Lance was here.
Never mind.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You guys are good?
As long as that's the only explanation.
It's all going according to plan, that's what he said.
I have nothing to add.
Okay. We were both not here. Sorry, Jason.
All right. So then, so naming panel is going to read really quick what Austin emailed me. So as you discuss naming panels, I've been curious about the demographics of who gets things named after them. I don't know if she wants me to read all of this, but I want to find a way to make sure it's not just focused on one target demographic. And it sounds like in Chris's district, she says it hasn't been, which is good. And she wants to do a broader exploration of that. And I know, Cameron, you also had some questions on this.
Who is that? Sent that?
Austin.
Austin.
Yeah, right. So since you've had some questions, do you want to kick off the conversation?
I would just like to know, I'd like to be a part of a group that would like to begin to explore how we do this. And I'm very interested in it and highly concerned about it. And so, but I don't know if we want to have a conversation today, but yeah, I think that I'll just repeat the same thing I said the last time. I think that the process of developing names for buildings and pieces of land within the city should be connected to a long-term vision for where we live and how we want to sort of talk about the history and origins of this city, and that it should not be driven by people who have access and money and friends, and should be thought through in a very intentional way, and that we are a part of creating some priorities for who that's done and what those names represent. So I'm very interested in being a part of that conversation, and I will just say that even the proposal that came up at Musher's Alley or Musher's Street or whatever that is, I think that it's I think we just think really short term. I think we're like, hey, this looks cool, let's do it, right? And in some ways, when I walk around our city or drive around our city, that's the way it looks. Like, that week we felt like this, and that week we felt like that, or that was a cool guy, and we put his face on a building, and not this sort of longer term, the identity of our city. And so I think that it's something that we need to give some attention to. So that's it.
Thank you. So I have Forrest, Crystal, Meg, Chris, and then me. Forrest?
Yeah, I'd say if you end up leading a subcommittee or a group, I'd love to be a part of it. One, on looking at maybe Mr. Hess, Daryl has a lot of subject matter expertise on this, and perhaps Cameron, if you want to lead that, and I would suggest bringing him in to that discussion, because he's always been sort of the go-to person when you want to get something named, or at least when I first got in the assembly, that was the case. I agree that it's driven largely by, a prominent member of the community passes away, and then we go out and find something to name after them. which is standard practice in a lot of places, and I don't think we need to get rid of that necessarily. But I've been involved in a process with the Anchorage Parks Foundation that brought together a group of other folks about indigenous place names. And it's funny, when I walked into our first meeting, I thought we were going to talk about, like, okay, let's rename a bunch of stuff. And they're like, no, we're taking a much more deliberative approach. They're starting with a series of interpretive signs throughout the city, like letting people know, like down at Westchester Lagoon, like this used to be called Chanchnu, and this body of water and that kind of thing. And I think that is a more deliberative approach. But at some point, that's going to evolve, I think, into a real push for indigenous place names in particular. Now, I think what you're talking about is something maybe even broader than that, where you're talking about an overall strategy for, how we name different things. To me, though,
and let me just interrupt for a second and say that that yes, I think that I don't think we need to create a whole strategy, that sort of thing, but I do think we need to have it something anchored, right? Yeah. Because I think there is a settler community, right? There is a pioneering community that wants that story told, and then there is sort of an indigenous sort of piece, and so I just think we need to figure out how to reconcile those tensions.
Yeah, and I would say that there's like a third part of the community, like the Betty Davis and the community there, where it's like they're not putting forward a traditional pioneer, prospector kind of thing. It's more like, well, over the last 50 years, there's always unique communities been living here, and they want to be acknowledged too. And when a prominent member passes away, they might want something named. But right now, there is, and I've expressed this in the previous rules meeting, there really is no way to proactively go out and name something an indigenous name, because in indigenous name, there's no triggering event to rename something in the way there is right now with prominent members. So I was just going to say, if you want to take the lead on that, I would love to be a part of it. And please loop in Daryl. I would suggest Daryl Hess and the Anchorage Parks Foundation, because both of them have done this kind of work in the past.
Thank you. Crystal?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'd mentioned before to you, Cameron, that I'd be interested in doing this. I know in my community right now, I've got 2 street renaming events going on, and one of them is working really well and the other is not. So the interesting part about it all is I appreciate your comment about the balance, how you balance all of this in terms of who gets priority when you're naming something. So I'd be interested in a couple of things. One would be seeing if we have a time period by which you're not going to name after somebody. It can't be like somebody died and then a month later we have all these people coming forward. There needs to be a time period by which we wait for some of that emotional part to kind of calm down, and then we can think through some of these things. But the other thing is to find a way to protect the names of certain things that we don't ever want to see changed. I mean, if that's true, if there are things that we think should never be changed, then we ought to be able to figure out how to protect that. Because the way it is right now, street names can be changed every 20 years. And I'm not sure that's really a good thing. So anyway, I'm really interested in figuring out how we not only have good processes and policies for how we name things, but how we also protect the things that we've already named. So I'd be more than happy to be on that committee. We do have some process problems, I think, with what's in code right now. So, and it's not just about who we name, it's about how we go about actually doing that naming. So thank you.
Thank you. Meg?
Thank you. So the school board is moving forward. So I will give you an update. So they wrote 3 schools: East High School, Fairview Elementary, and Airport Heights Elementary. They already started convening a naming panel on October 28th, 2019. And I have this as a member of the PTA of Airport Heights Elementary School. And so their timeline is really quite quick. They are meeting with parent organizations now. They are working from 2/28 to 3/27 to communicate to the community. And then a committee will review the results, and the superintendent will bring a recommendation to the board by the end of April 2020. I know Airport Heights Community Council will be taking this up next month at their community council meeting to look at a resolution. I won't spoil the surprise of which way they're going to go with their resolution. So, but it's moving quickly in that particular instance with regard to the late Senator Betty Davis and a school. So just want to make sure that was out
Just a
there.
clarification, does the school have the authority to name their building?
It's not the school. The school superintendent has the ability to make a recommendation to the board to rename the
So
school.
the school board has the authority to name.
That's the way that letter sounds, yes.
I believe it is, yes.
It doesn't come back to us. I mean, we own the building.
It doesn't go to
No.
the
Yeah.
It's so weird.
So-
We own the buildings. They made that clear with aquariums and stuff.
No, there's no assembly action on this letter. It
Yeah.
is simply the school board.
Yeah, the end all for that. Thank you. Chris?
So Fairview is such an interesting example. That neighborhood has 4 parks. South Addition next to it has 40 parks. And the trail, which is an endless park. And there's endless pressure to rename the parks of Fairview to be after some notable family, whatever their heritage might be. And there is a wellspring of resistance to that in the community because you don't want all of your parks, your 4 parks, suddenly locked down, because what you find is those parks then suddenly become a de facto property interest of the named interests, where the family members, I have seen it, and I'll give you an example. Earl and Muriel King Park, when I got my start trying to get a dog park, they appealed to Muriel King, who was 85 years old, and someone whispered to her, you don't want a dog park there, you want a tot park there. So they used her, and that actually convinced a number of people, you can't change this because Muriel King said so. And that's a de facto property interest in public property, and it's not right. And so there are a number of concerns with the process how we have it, separate from even, is it this or that or the other heritage that is recognized. But Fairview's resolution to that has been to recommend sub-parcels within a lot, an element of a rec center, part of the playground of a park, instead of giving away everything they have in 4 shots to people whose families may not even be here anymore, or that do have this long-term interest in keeping things how they want it. And so I'm interested in this conversation. I don't want it to be too restrictive that we can't find some opportunities to celebrate the people who've made a difference, but I also want to exercise caution in how we do this so that we aren't giving away more than we intend. You know, and there's one battle coming forward to us, probably all heard about it. It's the northwest corner of the park strip at L Street, and it's the monument to the young lady who was killed by her boyfriend. And the neighbors are done having monuments built on the park strip, and yet the Moores really want it, and it's a tension. It's a real tension. Yeah, and the drawings were quite horrific, actually. Knives reaching up from a fountain to their daughters. So there are concerns and there are issues and tensions in this process, and that's why we have a whole section of the code addressing how things are named. And so maybe some of this generates from just a closer view of that section of the code and a conversation about the specifics that are already there.
Thank you. All right, so I'm next in the line. So 2 things. First is I'm really interested in this conversation, particularly from a person of color perspective, and making sure that both from an indigenous perspective and from other people of color, that we are not engaging in erasure, and I think that's really important. And then second is, aside from Daryl, I know Daryl has a lot more experience in this than I do, but when I worked in the mayor's office, I staffed several naming panels, and so I'm very intimately familiar with the code on naming panels. And interestingly enough, I was actually involved in a naming panel that attempted to do something on the park strip, and that led to another part of code, because if you want to do something on the park strip, it has its own protection. Yeah. And then there are other naming panels I was involved in that did what Chris was talking about, which is within a building. I think one of them was in the Sullivan, and they named a specific room in the Sullivan after someone. And so naming panels can be very broad in scope, naming a particular park, or they can be very specific, naming the garden that's an entrance to a park. So that's, and also I would say there are 3 specific ways to name something through our naming panel code. You can do it person-based, but you can also do it place-based. You don't have to have a person to trigger naming something. You can say, I want to name this park, find a new name for this park, or find a new name for this, etc., etc. So it doesn't have to be based on a person. Or you could do it both, which I've engaged in as well, very specific. I want to name this thing after this person. So it's a very interesting process. So that's all to say that I'm very interested in being a part of this. Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I remember attending the Ethics Committee. Excuse me. An Ethics Committee meeting where we talked about naming panels. Did you
Can't
remember?
what the issues were actually at the time.
Well, you know, sometimes a family will donate some land for a park, and then when a member of that family passes away at some point in the future, when they come back and say, well, they paid for the land that was donated for this, maybe we should name this after them, and so. Sometimes you go into a naming panel and it's already sort of predetermined. You're looking for something to name after a specific person, and so we were struggling, as I remember having this discussion with members on the ethics board, what was actually right and proper, and what was the best way to do this. And I don't think we ever actually came up to the conclusions that I recall. And so, evidently, we still need to work on this a little bit further.
Thanks. Wait, did you?
I thought Forrest was going to
Sure.
go that.
Forrest?
Oh, no, I want to speak to that directly. I want Becky.
I want to speak to this.
I want to speak to something else.
Go ahead, Chris.
So, in the case that I previously mentioned, Earl and Muriel King Park, we bought the land from them. They didn't give us the land, we bought it from them, and still the family asserted ownership over the naming and the use 40 years after, 50 years after we took possession. So there's some challenges.
Thanks. Forrest?
Yeah, I was going to say briefly, I wanted to reiterate, we passed in 2017, I think it was 2016, the Indigenous Naming Ordinance. And to my knowledge, it's only been used once. It wasn't even really used. It was passed about the same time we renamed, Chonchnu Muldoon Park. We gave it its indigenous name. And I misspoke when I said a person's death triggers that event. That's not what I mean. Felix is of course right. If you can actively go in and rename everywhere, but we just don't do it. We just very rarely, I haven't seen on my time in the assembly, we go in and find something that's already been named and give it an indigenous name. The only time I've ever seen us do that kind of thing is when a person passes away. And then I've asked the administration repeatedly, well, when you did this, did you consider the indigenous name of that place? And the response is, well, that wasn't what we were doing. We started with the person, and then we went and found a place to name after them. That's that process, and there's no way to sort of insert an indigenous name into that process. So the Indigenous Naming Ordinance now only applies when we have a new thing to name, and there are relatively few new parks, right, or new things to name. And so that's kind of the whole, that right there is the gap for me. And I think at some point I'd like to see an Indigenous Naming Commission that is proactively going out and renaming things. And I think that might come about after this process that you're discussing, Mr. President.
Thanks. Daryl D. then Mick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are actually a couple of efforts in District 1, of course, which leads the way in naming. There's going to be a request to the Assembly in the near future to form a naming panel to consider renaming Fairview Park, which is 2 blocks from Fairview Elementary School, to rename it Fairview Delta Park. And the Fairview Community Council supports this. Delga is the 9.5 basket for Raven. There's now a 5-foot raven here in the park, and it's got a raven gate, so it retains the Fairview name, which the community likes, and it also adds an indigenous name. And a group of residents in Frontierland Park, which has a certain connotation, would like to rename that park with a Dena'ina name. So Aaron Leggett from the museum is working with the community. So that just shows that there's a lot of things that can be done if we think out of the box when it comes to naming. But the problem is, we have been creating so many naming panels in the last few years. We're going to run out of things to name, and the code says you can only rename something every 20 years. And I think Ms. Kennedy talked about somebody dies, and we rush and we form a naming panel. So I had I think it was 2 or 3 names that I calendared, people who had died a year ago. People were calling me, and I think contacting some of you, saying we need to name something after them. And I calendared a reminder 12 months later, and it popped up, and nobody had contacted any of us again about that. So I deleted that, because frequently somebody passes away, there's a lot of grief, a lot of angst, and frequently we as a community rush out and we name something right away. So one of the things you might consider, the code says the assembly can't take final action until after 12 months after somebody has passed, but you might also think about not even forming a panel until at least 12 or 18 months after somebody has passed. Let that emotion pass, and then you can judge it strictly on what were their contributions to the community, and take the grief and the trauma out of that decision.
Thank you.
I was just going to clarify quickly what Pete was talking about the ethics committee was simply if someone gave you property expecting that they would be named. So that's a subset, but it probably could be addressed as well.
Thanks. Megan, Cameron, then I do have to move on.
Sure, yeah, I think, as we have this conversation, I would like us to think about different triggering events, particularly for places. We have master planning processes happening at a lot of our parks. I think this is a great place to insert having part of this conversation with the community and others. I think we have a lot of processes where we don't necessarily, we say we don't really necessarily have a triggering event like someone passing, but I think we do have triggering events where we can put this into consideration. I believe Rush and Jack just went through a huge master planning process. I think this would be a great element to add into to have this consideration. And then because you're taking a big place off it and you're looking at distinct elements, that's also that opportunity to do something less than the whole. So I just want to throw that out there for those who are wanting to be super active in this and look at it.
No, it's a great. There's like 10 more than that. There's probably 24 things you could name within Rush and Jack Park. It's so huge.
Thank you. Cameron?
So I'm surprised at how emotional this is making me feel, and I so just excuse me for a second, but it blows my mind that we are letting people who've lived here for that long who name things, right? I mean, and that because someone important to them dies, we as a city, like, sure, you rented a room in my house, and something happened, and now you want to name the room in my house? No, and it doesn't change every year. That it's just so strange to me, and that we put that in the hands of people who live in a neighborhood. I mean, they may have lived in the neighborhood 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This place has been around for thousands of years, and so that doesn't make any sense to me at all. This whole thing doesn't make any sense to me at all. And for us, as people who are supposed to be representing the city, to take a step back and to say, this is a city that will be around for a long, long time, and to be able to be really thoughtful about how we name. I mean, I don't, a garden here or there, but I'm talking about, these parks and these buildings and these things that will be around for a long time, and that our children will grow up seeing the names of these things and know that. So I just think it really feels very haphazard. It feels very random, and that we've even put it out there that, when someone you love, when your Uncle Freddie dies and you're feeling that that's even an option. For you to be able to decide what a big park in our city gets to be named, and for you to rally up your friends to be able to do that, that seems really backwards to me. And so it's not to dishonor, not to disregard their pain or the importance that the people have had in this city, but it's more about, like, that seems backwards in terms of a process, and I really think it's worthwhile to rethink that in a practical and thoughtful way. So,
Thank you. Okay.
I just really quick, I would add a counterpoint to that I actually think there are a number of people worth recognizing from the last 50 years or 100 years of Alaska history.
Sure.
And I think there are a lot of reasonable reasons why that might be so. Again, this history of the African Americans redlined into one corner of our town, wiped away. There were 2 buildings named after them. One still exists. One hasn't quite landed yet. So that history is still erased. And so I think that it isn't just about those who've been here for 10,000 years. That's an important part of the conversation, but it's also about what impacts and values they have brought to our community as a whole. I've never seen someone who's just Uncle Joe died bring forward a naming panel. So, but I understand the emotion, and it will be a great conversation.
Let me just say this, that it's not to not think that those people and their contributions are not important. That is not at all what it is. But we need to think of other ways to honor them. That's my opinion, is that there are lots of ways that we can honor the people that have given to this community. But I just don't think that is necessarily the go-to option. It should be a pretty rare thing for us to do something like that.
All right. Thank you. So moving on, update on AML legislative session. Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's actually quite a bit different in Juneau last week than it was the previous year when AML had their conference down there. A year ago, the legislators, even in February, were already saying there's no way we're going to get to adjourn in 121 days. And they were right. They would ended up down there for about 180 days or whatever before they were totally done. And this year it seems to be totally different. I had 2 different legislators tell me they think they're going to be out of there in 121 days this year. And, feeling like there's a compromise in the works. And so that seemed to be positive. The governor, who did not did not come to speak to the AML group last year, showed up this year and spoke and took questions for about 35, 40 minutes, or he was there for at least an hour. And many of the questions were about the ferry system. And if my the area I represented was on the ferry and it had been eliminated, I'd have been asking a lot of questions about that myself. So that was an important subject. But the board did meet with the governor last year, and we did meet with the governor this year. And the first thing I noticed about that meeting was that the 4 individuals that sat in on that meeting that were part of the governor's staff last year, none of those people were back at that meeting this year. So you can read into that whatever you would like to read into it. I'm hoping that means the governor has learned a couple of things since his first year in office. And he seemed to be reaching out to groups where he wasn't doing that type of a thing last year. So maybe that's a good sign. And it could be the fact that he's heard about this recall election. But one of the things that I picked up on that could have an effect on Anchorage, and I mentioned this to Jason the other night at the assembly meeting, was that we had a presentation about bonds, because we started this discussion about putting a general obligation bond on the ballot, and we've been sort of pushing the legislature to do that as a way to get some funding for our port, and also do some long overdue maintenance at other ports and harbors around the state. what I found out during this presentation was that a general obligation bond that passed in 2012, $110 million worth, none of those bonds have been issued. And I know for a fact that some of those projects have already been completed. But I didn't have to look at that bond package to see what items were in there. The projects hadn't been completed, but I know there were some ports and harbor money in that bond. So I think it would be great if we could take a look at that bond. Maybe there's already some funding approved for the port that hasn't been issued. But that was actually what I considered some good news, and I'm glad you were here to hear about it, because you probably got some feedback you'd like to give me about that.
And I'll just mention quickly that passing the bond gives the entity the ability to spend the money. So the state has probably spent that money in the same way that we spend the money, and then when we reach a certain amount, we actually go out and issue the bonds. It may very well be that the state chose, for whatever reason, not to issue those bonds and just pay for that out of some other pot of money. But it does not mean that there's money there that could be respent. The money itself is probably already been spent.
Well, part of the reason, some pushback on the general obligation bond that I heard from a couple legislators was they thought that our bonding authority was already up near the top, and they were worried that if we borrowed much more, it might have an effect on the state's credit rating. And I don't see how the state's credit rating can go much lower at this point anyway. But you know, if we looked at that and figured out which projects had already been completed, we could take those off there, and that might give the state more bonding authority, because that authority that was already approved wouldn't be needed for those projects that were already completed if they weren't planning on issuing bonds to pay for that, pay for what had already been done. And I know there was $15 million that I put in there to start the process to get the Muldoon overpass rebuilt, and that was almost paid entirely by federal funds. Very little, if any, of the bonding money that I put in there was used. And I think that between the state and the muni, we ended up with less than $1 million in getting that whole overpass done. So that was almost all federal funds. And I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any about anything else that might have taken place at A&L.
All right, any questions for Pete? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our last subject before audience participation, walkthrough of municipal ombudsman suite. Yeah, go ahead, Desiree.
Just really quick, since the appropriation's been approved, the administration and Chad have restarted the remodel on the bank area. I don't know if you walked past it, but yeah, I walked past it this morning, looked in the windows. It's a mess.
Oh, I was inside this morning.
Yeah.
The workers know you're going to be coming over.
Yeah. So the good part is like the controller's office had surplus of 13 cubicle spaces, so desks, walls, probably won't need those, but anyways, they're saving it for us, so we're gonna have that to offset a big chunk of the furniture costs. So I think that's a good piece of news to share with everybody. They're holding it for us, and they're aware that it's coming our way. So I don't know who wants to go. Do we have enough time to go?
Yeah, we have enough time. We can go.
I will move to extend the meeting by 10 minutes.
Any opposition? Okay.
The old space first? It says
Yeah,
old and new.
we can do old first. Sure.
Old is what we should do first.
I'll stay with everyone.
Okay. Sure?
Oh, yeah.